What's going on, everyone? So it is another day and another spoiler session. I know yesterday I mentioned that, well, it seems like we are entering into spoiler season, and well, today kind of confirms that. We got quite a few spoilers with the Gamegenic stream that we had today, as well as some new art for some bases, which is really sweet if that interests you. But these cards are actually extremely cool. I know a lot of people aren't as excited about them, but I think there's a lot of potential here, and I wanted to talk about them today. Tomorrow I got, an old video for you. We're testing out some of the random planetary qualifier decks that I've been winning, and we're going to see if they're as good as they seem to be. So if you want to check that out, well, check out that subscription down below. Also, a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, as well as I have a TCG player link in the description down below that you all want to check out. Let's start us off with some brand new spoilers. Starting us off with a brand new legendary in the Devastator. It is an 8 cost space unit in aggression villainy. It is a 9/6, so very aggressively statted. Imperial vehicle capital ship. So it is a capital ship. It is Imperial tag, and it does have the vehicle tag. It says you assign all indirect damage you deal to opponents, and then when played, you deal 4 indirect damage to each opponent. So this is really important for those of you that maybe hadn't seen the Boba Fett leader, or maybe no explanation of as to what indirect damage is, and there is a little few tricks to it. I'm going to pull up this right here, which is the Boba Fett leader, the new Boba Fett, that is, which has a little bit of a tooltip that can go ahead and perfectly explain this. This one says, anytime you go ahead and deal an indirect damage to a player, in this case, 1 indirect damage to a player, that player will assign 1 unpreventable damage among their base and units. And this is something that's really important because when I've previously talked about oh my gosh, I forget the name of it, but the 2-cost aggression villainy unit that basically allowed you to deal 2 indirect damage if you have the initiative on attack, basically couldn't actually defeat the shield. That's actually not the case because it is unpreventable. So things like shield tokens are unable to prevent this damage from actually happening. It's a really important kind of key part of this description. So basically, you deal indirect damage, that opponent gets to assign it to whatever base and or unit that they have. Now, it's important to note that it's not that you can kind of assign each individual damage. It's you can assign that instance of indirect damage. So if you deal 1 indirect damage, your opponent gets to assign that 1 damage to a base or a unit. If you deal 3 indirect damage, that opponent assigns 3 damage to a base or unit unpreventably. Now, if we pop back over to that spoiler card, this means that your opponent, assuming that we didn't have this text above it, would have to assign that 4 damage to a base or unit. However, because we are able to assign all of our indirect damage, we now can force our opponent to take 4 damage or a unit to take 4 damage. Honestly, this looks way more exciting as a aggressive, I'm going to slap you for 4 into the face with this card, because what I'm thinking about this is Triple Dark Raid. Obviously, anything that's expensive vehicle, Triple Dark Raid is the immediate go-to, but we have the new Boba Fett leader, who is aggression villainy, and we already know how strong cunning villainy is. Heck, you could even play the new Boba Fett set 4 leader with Boba Fett's armor if you're playing cunning, which Triple Dark Raid is, and suddenly you've got yourself an interesting combination. If you're going Triple Dark Raid, you can pay essentially 6 resources for this, right? Because you get a 2 resource discount. So you Triple Dark Raid, 6 resources, you get down a Devastator. It's a 9/6 readied up immediately that deals 4 damage to your opponent's face. That is a 13 damage Triple Dark Raid on that single turn. That is absolutely insane. That is a lot of damage. That is going to end basically any game that you got. And 6 resources is a very reasonable turn, right? Let's say you're sitting on your Triple Dark Raid. Maybe you use 1 early. You get your Ruthless Raider, your Fett's Fire Spray. Then you got a couple Devastators in the deck, maybe like 2 of or whatever, 3 of maybe if you're going full indirect damage. You wait for your Triple Dark Raid on turn 5 when you can go ahead and actually, well, if we pop back over to the Boba Fett leader, mind you, this is a 5-turn flip. So turn 5 flip with the 6 resources. So you can do something crazy like, I'm going to Triple Dark Raid. Okay. I'm going to Triple Dark Raid. Get my Devastator down, deal 4 to your face, put Boba Fett on my Devastator, it's suddenly a 13 powered unit, and I actually hit 17 damage in a single turn to your face, just with a single card combined with your leader. That seems interesting stuff. Mind you, we actually, because of Boba Fett, can actually deal another damage whenever we deal non-combat damage to deal another damage. So it's actually not quite 17 damage, it's 18 damage, which is just so cool. So there's a lot of cool implications with this aggressive indirect damage, and I do think that this does have a place with Triple Dark Raid. There might be some viability with this being an endgame finisher as 8 resources, but I'm much more excited about it in the Triple Dark Raid deck, because just putting this down with Triple Dark Raid forces your opponent to basically have like a Rival's Fall or Fell the Dragon or a Vanquish or something like that to immediately kill it. And heck, if you do have that Boba Fett flip and they don't immediately deal with it, then suddenly you can go ahead and put it on the Devastator and it won't be able to be vanquished or Fell the Dragon. I suppose that if they had it, they probably would have just used it because you'll just attack with it anyways, so that's probably not all that relevant, but it's going to hit your opponent and kill them if you are at that point in the game. Again, 17 damage with a Boba Fett or 13 damage on just Devastator alone. If you are playing Boba Fett leader, you don't even have to put this on the Devastator. It'll deal 14 damage because you'll get that additional one from Boba Fett. All of that just seems absolutely crazy. And again, this basically reads to me as you assign all indirect damage as damage to your opponent's face. And there are some situations where you may deal 4 to whatever's on the battlefield and try to, you know, kind of keep the board clear of whatever. That does happen, but I'm much more likely to hit your opponent for 13, 14 damage in a single turn. So Devastator looks absolutely sweet for that. Next up, we've got Independent Smuggler. It's a 1-cost ground unit in Cunning. It's a 1/1 with Raid 1, but it also has piloting for 1 resource. And you're able to play this as an upgrade on a friendly vehicle without a pilot, as piloting does, to give that unit +1/+1 and Raid 1. This is a little bit unassuming, but I think this is one of the more interesting implications for piloting. A lot of people talk about how much upgrade the heat there is. Oh, I get 2 for 1, all this stuff. And that's absolutely true. And that's why something like Chewbacca looks interesting, because you can avoid some of that, right? But at the same token, these really cheap piloting units for a lot of stats also look incredibly interesting, because if your opponent's using Confiscate or something of that nature where it gets to remove an upgrade on an upgrade that costs 1 resource, that's probably a pretty fair trade, and it's really not that big of a downside, while also giving you a pretty powerful boost. 1 resource for +2/+1 on attacks is pretty insane. So I really think that has some viability in the game, and I'm curious to see what this is capable of. Not super exciting and nothing too crazy in general. Pretty simple upgrade, pretty cheap, and I definitely think you can go like Cartel Turncoat, or you can go any matter like Wolfpack Escort, any matter of 1-cost units on turn 1, equip this or pilot this onto those units, and suddenly you have a really powerful scenario. Heck, if you're playing that wedge deck that we saw earlier, or the wedge leader that we saw earlier, you can definitely go something of Cartel Turncoat on turn 1 plus Cartel Turncoat. So 2 Cartel Turncoats, smuggle or pilot. I keep saying smuggle because I think of smuggling, but pilot this guy onto one of those Cartel Turncoats for free. And suddenly you have essentially a 4/4 Cartel Turncoat on attacks. And then maybe on turn 2, you play Millennium Falcon with another pilot, like another Independent Smuggler. If we have more of these cheap pilots, maybe we can have a really, really strong piloting deck with Wedge. This is a lot more interesting to me in an aggressive strategy when you're able to have these very cheap pilots that don't really bite back if you get 2 for 1 or something like that, because all you care about is getting in early damage. So I think that's really way more of an interesting strategy than going with these big pilots and casting or playing them for a little bit cheaper, which, well, suddenly really loses hard to like Fella Dragon, for example. And next up, we've got another legendary in Planetary Bombardment. And this one's just silly. It's just silly. It is crazy. It's a 6-cost event in just aggression. You deal 8 indirect damage to a player. If you control a capital ship, you can deal 12 indirect damage instead. Of course, this immediately screams, give me my Devastator, because suddenly you could pay 6 to deal 12 to your opponent's face. That is absolutely crazy, right? But realistically, I don't see this being incredibly insane. If you think about it, let's say you're playing a more aggressive deck. You play Planetary Bombardment. Your opponent has a unit. It just kills their unit. Okay, 6 cost event to kill one of your opponent's units. Not exactly that strong. Of course, there could be some indirect damage synergies, and maybe that makes it worth it, but I don't really see that being the case. Let's say you're playing a control deck, on the other hand, and you play this, and your opponent's just going to take 8 to the face. Like, they don't even care because you're playing a more controlling deck. And if you're in a spot where they can't take 8 to the face, you're probably winning the game anyways in that controlling game plan. So this really only fits, at least for me, in a deck that's really going to benefit from the indirect damage just being played, or in a deck that's playing Devastator. And there are some really cool stuff. Like if you play Devastator and then you play Planetary Bombardment, you're going to kill them. There's going to be very few scenarios where that doesn't kill someone. On the other hand, are you already winning when you play Devastator? Probably. So to me, this looks like a little bit of a finicky legendary where I don't really see it's being super viable, but I could be very wrong depending on what we get with indirect damage payoffs. I think this is very much, okay, we need to see way more indirect damage, and maybe just dealing 8 indirect damage will trigger something else or trigger this other thing, and then you'll get all these things triggering, and it's going to be insane. I can definitely see that. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we have a bunch of new special art, full art, hyperspace bases from set 1. Jabba's Palace, Catacombs of Katera, Dagobah Swamp, and Echo Base. This comes with the Gamegenic deck boxes, like little bundle, I believe, which they offered. And I'm not exactly sure, or the deck pods is what they call them. But I'm not really sure exactly the prices on these things. I just wanted to mention it for you because I'm sure people are going to be on TCG Player selling off these just arts in general. And I do think it's really cool to see different arts for some of these bases in the game. So I just thought that was a little bit of a cool shout out at the end here, as I really hope that they start doing showcase bases. That's one thing that I would actually maybe consider diving into. Of course, I've always wanted a showcase leader, and that's another thing that I'd consider. But to me, like the bases and the leaders are the things that I'm really like, oh my gosh, that's sick. Alongside, of course, the Prestige editions, I think those are sick as well. But it's much more likely for you to show up with a base that you can go ahead and show off because it's your base versus a unit that you hope to draw, so that you can go ahead and show that off, right? Just what I think, at least. Let me know what you think about these bases, and also let me know what you think about these new cards. Devastator, is this going to be like insane? I actually think there's a lot of viability with a cunning aggression villainy deck. Who knew? Because that's what old Boba Red was, but new Boba Red. Is that actually going to be back? Is Boba back? Is Boba back? I think he actually has a very, very good chance of being back if indirect damage and some of these cards play out as I think they will. And I've already played around with them a little bit, just like in some very memey games, but it looks a lot of fun. Independent Smuggler. I'm really curious to see if we're going to see a lot more of these cheap pilots. Right now, we've seen a lot more expensive ones, or like, 3-cost pilots. We saw Anakin, which was a 2-cost pilot, which was a little bit on the cheaper side. So we're obviously going to see more cheap pilots, but I'm curious to see how many of them we're going to get if we can really build a deck around them. So maybe Wedge will be better than some people think. Planetary Bombardment. Is this a meme, or can we actually get use out of it? Let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.